Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to members of the International Police Association. It is a pleasure. These are challenging times, but they do give us a unique opportunity to interact with new forums. So thank you for hosting the University of Lodz during one of your meetings. Thank you for the invitation. I have been requested to speak briefly on my research that might be useful to the members of the association. So I will try to give you a very brief glimpse at legal aspects of cyber forensics, if you will. I work at the University of Lodz. You can see the lovely background here. I work at the Department of International Law, and in my research and my daily work, I focus on international law and how it applies to cyberspace. From the law enforcement perspective, this is interesting because clearly the transboundary network impacts everyday work and lives of law enforcement officers. So I will try to look at what has been referred to as the darknet, an area in cyberspace, if you will, that at times is challenging to look into, to get a hold of. I do have a few slides. I will try to share my screen with you. Let's just see how that works. And I will try to give you a very brief glimpse of what the so-called darknet is, whether this really is a dark area of the internet, what it means, how it works, how one can look inside, and how easy or difficult it is to look into the dark side of the network. So with this, let me start with a relatively easy, pragmatic example. When you surf the net, at times you end up at an image like this one. So you would be inclined to see a restriction on your accessibility to certain websites. This one in particular is based on geolocation. So you might be trying to reach a certain location online, and because you are physically located at a specific geographical spot, you will be refrained from reaching that specific location. Now, we call this geo-blocking. Nothing new, we've had this before. What you will see in EU law and national laws, respectively, would be the application of this regulation 2018 that deals with unjustified geo-blocking. The very name unjustified geo-blocking makes you question the legitimacy of geo-blocking in itself. So there clearly is a fine line that could be crossed when geo-blocking is unjustified. Because we tend to interpret the limits of national jurisdiction online in different ways in different countries, sometimes geo-blocking proves challenging. On one hand, we seem to agree that indeed, particularly for the reasons of a unified market, we might need to block access to certain content in certain areas of the European Union, since this is an EU legal document, whereas at the same time, clearly the very title here, not to speak about the contents, focus on the challenge that we are facing with this. So you might be a Polish citizen, and if you were trying to access Polish television online, but you were located in Germany, you might encounter certain content being blocked. Would it be illegal for you to try and circumvent that blocking? Is it really justified for the purpose of a unified market? Now, I'm moving forward, assuming, acting under the assumption that we all know it is relatively easy to circumvent that blocking and access the content you were initially trying to read, view, listen to. Sometimes, however, the blocking originates from a different legal framework. It is based on a different legal principle. And sometimes there's no reason given to you. You try to access certain content and the video is not available. There is a range of reasons why this could happen. We would assume that when such unavailability is rooted in law, there is a legitimate legal basis. But the average internet user would probably not look at that basis. What they would like to do is probably just access the content. For them to do so, they might try to trick the machines to make it look as if they were geographically placed somewhere else, or they had a legitimate mandate to access that blocked content. Now, this is where things start getting interesting. Website blocking is a relatively broad area of contested policy nationally and worldwide. We discuss website blocking as, on one hand, a necessary practice to set legal boundaries online. But in parallel, there is a very valid discussion around limits of freedom of expression or accessing information online. Freedom of expression does mean that you have the right to access information, and only based on a very specific implementation of a norm of law can this right be restricted. So we struggle internationally to try and find the right balance between freedom of information and security. You can you can look into different website blocking mechanisms, whitelists, blacklists. The whole point of this is to hide a portion of the internet from everyday users, from certain groups of users. As you can see, these are different mechanisms. And this is just an example you see here on the slide. There are NGOs looking into specific processes behind blocking certain content. As you can see, reasons here, it could be copyright, could be child protection, could be unity of the European market, as we just said, with geo-blocking, etc., etc. So there are different principles, legal principles, that would allow certain content to be disabled in certain locations or to certain individuals. Whether this is legitimate and rooted in law would be for courts to decide on a one-to-one basis. The reason why we try to avoid certain restrictions put online originates from the urge to obtain information, to the freedom of expression as it applies to freedom of accessing information. But more significantly, people trying to avoid getting identified or discovered online is motivated by surveillance. There is advanced online surveillance, and again, it is based on national legal standards, safeguards, but the internet has made it fascinatingly easy for an individual to be surveilled online. This could be done by law enforcement officials, this could be done by national agencies, but this could also be done by foreign agencies who are trying to collect as much information on individual users as only possible. Now, let me just bring your memory back to the Snowden revelations, where it was the NSA that was collecting information en masse on individual end users. So one of the reasons for people trying to go into the darknet would be trying to access illegal information, whatever that means. But the surge towards anonymity online is also motivated by surveillance. We could look into individual laws also here in Poland, but this is not something we want to do. We want to go right into the so-called darknet. Before we get there, let me just note, forever more governments are encouraged to use new technologies. You can see one of the providers here, to collect as much intelligence on end users as they only can. You could argue this is a cat and mouse game. So on one hand, the government's law enforcement agencies are trying to collect as much information as only technically possible using advanced software like the one offered by 𝗩𝗕𝗕𝗓. And on the other hand, individual end users like myself are growing concerned about their privacy and trying to hide as much information that is available online about themselves as only possible. Now, we do tend to encourage everyday internet end users to protect their privacy. And this is not because of governments, foreign or national, trying to obtain that information. We look into encryption, we look into avoiding surveillance technologies, not because primarily of the concern coming from governments and law enforcement agencies, but all those other lovely individuals you could see here on the slide. So my communications might be circumvented, might be identified and used by the bad guys, so to speak, and you can see a multitude of them here on the slide. We encourage individuals as a matter of cyber hygiene or cybersecurity hygiene to encrypt their information, to erase their traces online, because if they do not, Eves here on the slide will circumvent their communications and replace it with their own content. This is not something we want to do, and we encourage everyday end users to stay wary of Eves and take necessary precautions to make sure that he is helpless, he cannot obtain your information. Now, we usually encourage those end users to use encryption. We tell them that if their message is encrypted, it will be far more difficult for Eves, if not impossible, to steal your data and replace your banking order with the amount that they see fit and the account number that they see fit. So we encourage encryption. Encryption tends to look like a black box to us, but it's not. It's nothing new. We just replaced words or letters with symbols, as we have done. You can see here the example on the right for ages. It's just that now it is more advanced. So we have those encryption keys and very advanced modules that help us encrypt a simple message saying, "Hi, how are you?" into a sequence of numbers that will be impossible to decode if you do not have the right encryption key. Thus far, encryption is the only tool we have trying to protect our private communications and security online. We encourage end users to use encrypted messaging services. You can see Signal here, whose popularity is rising. You can see Proton Mail, also advertised as the Swiss looker for your communications. I've left WhatsApp here, although, as I'm certain you've noted, their business model seems to be changing to the worse as we speak. But there indeed are services who have built their business models around encryption and security of individual communications. You can advance that protection when you also use virtual private networks. So through a VPN, you will be able to secure not only the communications that comes from your computer and comes to your computer, a phone, whatever machine you're using, but you would also be able to encrypt the so-called weakest link of that network. So whatever communication comes through a Wi-Fi to your computer, whatever external resources you would be using. So by the combination of an encrypted service, a VPN, you can keep your communications safe. Now, keeping your communications safe through encryption might also mean using a unique browser, an encrypted browser. The most popular one would be Tor, and again, talking to law enforcement official, I'm certain that Tor needs no explanation, but we are talking about encryption on multiple levels. So you would be encrypting your communications in a number of steps. Individual encryption would happen between the servers, roughly 7 servers that you would go through when trying to reach your destination. And because that message would get encrypted and decrypted a number of times, it would be impossible for someone circumventing that chain of communications to read your message. Now, this could be a harmless message, like me saying, "Hi, how are you?" Or this could be criminal content. Still, we will never know because it is encrypted. So encryption does work sort of like a double-edged sword, but which technology doesn't? Those who use encryption do tend to go into the dark side of the internet. There's data, there's research being presented on the numbers. Now, I'm using that popular reference here. Some say that it is 96% of internet content that is hidden. So if you're not using Tor like Edward Snowden, you will likely never explore 96% of the internet. Now, might be a bit of a biased take on the darknet, but indeed, if you want to reach a specific location, you might encounter geo-blocking, or you might encounter some sort of a firewall that will disable you from reaching it. But if you have the technology, and if you do use Tor and encryption and the appropriate tools, you will be able to reach the deep web. You can see this here. So a very specific location, like a private movie someone shared with you of a birthday that they just celebrated. Or you could even go into the dark web, allegedly an area where all the criminal activity happens. Now, let us keep in mind, criminal activity is a very relative term, depending which law you will be looking into. But this is the rough understanding of the darknet as we have it right now. So whatever is made available to you through Google, let's say, through your average browser, will probably be just a small portion of the internet. If you want the really good stuff, the interesting stuff, you have to dig deeper. And if you want to do that safely, use Tor. That's the basic message behind the darknet. Now, I understand that the darknet does have a certain negative meaning to it. Clearly, if someone really wants to hide their communications, they might be communicating something more controversial than just, hi, how are you? And that is indeed the truth. Criminal activity online has surged thanks to those encryption technologies. Now, I am certain that the favorite case we all like to reference here is the Silk Road, what once was a trade route from China reaching into Europe in last months or years has become to mean a website where you could buy all substances, all items that would be recognized as illegal in the majority of jurisdictions in the world. Not only, but also drugs or arms would be offered on the virtual Silk Road. Now, that website clearly was taken down thanks to collaboration of law enforcement officers across the globe. But it had us thinking about the limits of law enforcement online and the validity of using encryption. Had there been no encryption, or if law enforcement authorities had the keys to encryption, it would be much easier to find the bad guys behind that clearly criminal activity, selling drugs. Well, that is illegal in most jurisdictions in the world. This, however, proves difficult. Trying to enforce national laws online is challenging. Why? We tend to think about our internet here in Poland as well. There's this strong narrative around the Polish internet, national sovereignty online. You could think that if you look at the internet, as you can see that here, just a bunch of underwater wires through which the communications flow. But the internet is much more than that. It's not just those wires. It's not just a telecommunications infrastructure. It is the layer of the code that is developed through standards by technical communities around the globe, international communities of volunteers like the IETF develop standards. It's not law, it's not regulated nationally by the law, but it is the law of cyberspace, if you will. And only on top of these two do we have the layer of content where the drugs or the illegal pictures come in. So for us to be able to effectively manage that resource, we would need to go beyond just the content layer. We would need to manage all three. And we would need to make sure that whatever encryption happens in our cyberspace would be A, illegal, and some countries are pursuing that agenda, or that law enforcement would have access to those encryption keys to keep us safe, or of course, based on legal provisions. Some countries are doing this. We talk about the splinternet growing, and I am certain that you are well aware of the Chinese firewall or Russia proclaiming independence online in recent years. That is one way to do it. If we want to be effective online, including effective law enforcement, not just policy making, we might want to think about the internet as a national space. That would be much easier. We could regulate it with national law and set the limits for privacy, freedom of expression, online as we see fit according to national law. There's a downside to this, however. We will lose the internet as a whole. National networks will be nothing like the global network we have right now. So this is an interesting time. This is a time of trial where we will try to understand whether it is worth to keep, some argue, the greatest invention of the 20th century, that is the internet, or whether we should just give up and have smaller national networks that will be fully controlled, and we can decide which layer of protection is granted to end users. But this is just a very brief glimpse at the challenge that we are facing. It seems as if this is a new universal time of trial. We have to decide on the right balance between security and privacy. As many have been saying for a few years now, it's about prioritizing both privacy and security, freedom of expression and security. So this is an interesting time. The same technology that could allow criminals to go into the darknet, the deep web, and commit crimes is also used to protect everyday end users like myself, to keep their data safe from unauthorized access. This is all I wanted to share in terms of the dark web or the darknet. I know this is just an invitation to a discussion, but I am hoping that this might incite hopefully provocative thoughts with you, and we can meet again and discuss the darknet and jurisdiction implications after the pandemic. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Take good care. Goodbye.